So as we talk about global governance and international organizations, the voting mechanisms that international organizations use ends up being a really important part of the story about how these organizations make decisions, but also in terms of who controls these organizations and really has a lock over their decision making. And so I want to talk about some basic vocabulary related to international organizations and how they function, and then walk through an example with the International Monetary Fund that sort of shows how this can function in action. And so I'll begin by noting that international organizations oftentimes have different bodies that they are comprised of. There may be a plenary representative body that is essentially a committee of the whole. Everybody who's a member of the organization gets to participate in that decision-making body. So in the United Nations, it's the UN General Assembly, where everybody gets to be a member and participate, and everybody has one vote who's a member of the United Nations system. But a lot of the important decision-making within the United Nations doesn't occur within the General Assembly. In fact, the General Assembly primarily just passes resolutions that are symbolic. More limited membership councils, whether it's the Economic and Social Council or the Human Rights Council or the Security Council, end up having much greater authority and are much more limited. So these are limited membership councils where only a select set of countries are able to participate at any given time. And they're oftentimes focused on a very specific set of tasks and get to have maybe not control over an agenda, but at least the ability to kind of set and drive an agenda through those subset organizations. And so the United Nations Security Council is really sort of the classic example here, where within the United Nations system, yes, the General Assembly can pass sort of symbolic resolutions, but the real core power within the United Nations system is held by the Security Council, which is comprised of now 15 members. Used to be 10, but 15 members, of which 5 are permanent members, and the other 10 are elected on a rotating 2-year cycle. So different organizations will have power divided out across different committees or councils. And then it's also worth paying attention to how those organizations make those decisions. So in some situations, it's just a simple majority vote, right? 50% plus 1 is all it takes to pass a measure. General Assembly resolutions in the United Nations take a 50% plus 1 threshold for passing. Other organizations use a supramajority voting threshold. So within the International Monetary Fund, decisions that are made by the executive committee have to have 85% in order to be able to pass. So anytime you have a supermajority, it requires a larger than 50% plus 1 threshold. That's going to require a greater level of consensus in order to get things passed. And if you really want consensus, you can have unanimity voting, where everybody has to agree in order for something to pass. And if anybody doesn't agree or doesn't go along or doesn't support that decision, then it doesn't move forward. An example where we see unanimity voting is with the World Trade Organization, and how the World Trade Organization makes its rules with its negotiation is that trade talks are broken up into hundreds, if not thousands, of different subcommittees that work on different parts and different tasks. And as they negotiate through and work on wording for, what's the tariff rules and trade rules that are going to be in place around grapes. For example, the grapes committee will hammer out that wording and then put out a call, is anybody in favor? You get a few votes, yes. Is anybody opposed? And if nobody objects, the rules pass. But that doesn't require everybody to vote yes. It just means that nobody in the room at that particular moment in time objected. Which means that if you want to really lock in and guarantee a certain outcome on grapes, you have to hold the room and ensure that you're always there to block anything going forward that you don't like, and hopefully outlast or push out or drive away the people who are objecting to the things that you want through, so that when the decision comes, that you and your supporters are the only ones in the room. So unanimity voting can mean genuine consensus, or it can just mean that we've structured the decision process in such a way that objections are not present. We also need to think about, when thinking about voting within international organizations, the fact that maybe not all states are in an equal position, or maybe don't have an equal say or equal influence over a problem. Within the United Nations General Assembly, there's a principle that each country is sovereign. Each country should be represented and represented equally, and each country should have one vote. And when the United Nations General Assembly was being debated and discussed, and Franklin Roosevelt was trying to explain to Stalin how it worked, Stalin countered and said, well, shouldn't, important countries like the United States and the Soviet Union have more votes? Wouldn't it be more reasonable for the United States and the Soviet Union each to have 4 votes, for example? And Roosevelt said, no, the General Assembly is the principle that all countries are equal in that they're sovereign and they get one vote. And the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union are very powerful is going to be reflected not in the General Assembly, it's going to be reflected in the Security Council, where we're going to have permanent seats for the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. But also, these countries will have a veto. These 5 permanent members will be able to block anything that comes through that they don't want. Now, in practice, the UN veto doesn't require those 5 states, the permanent members, to all vote affirmatively. States can abstain, and if they don't exercise their veto, it's considered enough to let things pass. But the UN Security Council operates on the premise of majority vote, simple majority rule, plus no permanent member can exercise their veto. And that veto can be a very powerful way for states to prevent things from moving forward that they don't like. In other situations, you get something close to what Stalin had been advocating for, a weighted voting system, where some states get more votes and more influence over a process than others. We'll look at the International Monetary Fund, where the weight of votes that a country gets is a function of sort of its economy, but also its share of how much it's contributing into the international organization, and that determines its vote share. The other place where we see weighted voting is with the UN Convention on Climate Change and the rules that were set up governing that to get a resolution like the Paris Climate Accords to pass requires, I think, 55% of members who are part of that convention to sign on and say, yes, I want this to go through, and countries representing 55% of global carbon emissions in 1992. So countries like the United States and Russia, which were major carbon emitters in 1992, have a serious share of the vote. I think the United States is like 25% of the vote that is needed to get to that 55% threshold, so that if you need either the United States or Russia to be able to get across that line and be able to get a resolution passed or a climate deal passed. So you have different ways of dealing with differences in power amongst countries, and I want to kind of illustrate this in the context of the International Monetary Fund, where we see the weighted voting principle playing out in maybe a more magnified way than I think you might necessarily expect if I just said that the votes the countries hold is based on the amount that they contribute. And the way I'll maybe start this is by noting that states elect members to an executive board of 24 members. And so while there's, 180-ish members of the International Monetary Fund, there are only 24 seats that actually get representation. And so the United States is represented. It has a member on the executive board, Elizabeth Sciortino. Sorry, I'm butchering your name, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth represents the United States and holds 16.5% of the vote total. Now, the IMF operates on a supramajority voting rule that requires 85% to get anything passed. So because the United States has 16.5% of the vote, if the United States doesn't vote for something, it's essentially vetoing it, because you'll never get to the 85% threshold with that vote share from the United States, not part of that final result. So the US has a veto with this. So there's other countries. Japan has 6.14% of the vote, and they have a representative on this seat. And other countries as well. China, Germany, France, UK all have representatives. Russia also has a representative, but you'll note here that Russia is kind of paired with the Syrian Arab Republic, which is kind of weird. They only represent 2.68% of the vote. But again, that seems odd that it's Russia and the Syrian Arab Republic. But actually, this is how the International Monetary Fund deals with the fact that it has many, many more members than it has seats. It lumps countries together that individually don't have a large enough vote share to really be meaningful, but when pooled together, they can potentially they can potentially represent a larger voting bloc and send a representative forward. And so this is one of those voting blocs. This is a bloc that represents 4.53% of the IMF vote share, and it pulls together, Colombia, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico. So basically sort of Central American countries, also I guess Colombia's in South America, and also Spain, which is strange economically because countries in Central and South America are maybe more in the developing spectrum, middle income countries. Spain is a fairly well-developed country. Also, it's part of the euro, so in terms of currency, it's in a very different situation, but they all speak Spanish, so maybe if I squint, I can say, well, this kind of makes sense. It's also worth noting that Mexico and Spain are the two largest vote share holders within this bloc, and not entirely surprisingly, the representatives and the alternate for the executive board are from Mexico and Spain. And that tends to be kind of how these clusters of countries work, that the largest country or the largest members of these clusters tend to select their own representative to speak for and vote for that larger bloc. Now, again, if these blocks represent sort of an economic reality, all the countries are kind of in the same boat, maybe that's fine. This is another block representing 5.46%. It contains a lot of countries that are kind of maybe Eastern Europe, so Cyprus, Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania, so maybe former Soviet or Soviet bloc countries like Romania and Ukraine. Israel is also in there, which is kind of strange, but maybe Mediterranean coast-ish, except that the two largest vote share holders within this bloc are the Netherlands and Belgium, who are small, industrialized Western European countries who select the representatives for these blocs. And so that's a little bit strange, but not quite as strange as this one, where it's a good chunk of sort of Central Asian countries along with Switzerland and Poland. And Switzerland and Poland are representing, landlocked countries in Central Asia that are at a very different place in terms of economic development, in terms of economic interests, and yet Switzerland is casting that 2.8% vote that's well above what it would ever be able to wield if it was just representing itself within the International Monetary Fund. And so what we see is that it's not just the weighting of the voting, it's also the process of selecting who gets to be at the table that can determine who has power within these organizations. And so one of the things that sort of comes out of this is that the head of the International Monetary Fund is always a European, and the head of the World Bank is always an American, because the United States and European countries have decided that that's how they're going to share power across these two Bretton Woods organizations. And it's also worth noting, because we've had the conversation about the new international economic order in developing countries pushing back and saying we need to have greater voice, we need to have greater representation within these international organizations. What they're saying is not just we want more power in terms of weighted voting. What they're saying is that the rules of these systems are really structured in such a way where our voice is being taken, subsumed, acquired, and represented by other states that are not economically where we're at and maybe don't have our economic interests at heart. And when we think about reshuffling the way that we allocate votes within the International Monetary Fund, maybe trying to give developing countries the ability to control some of these blocks within the selection of the board of directors for the International Monetary Fund or the executive board would be a reasonable compromise to maybe balance out the representativeness of this organization.